also talked to Ambassador Sondland about the conversations that he had had in Warsaw with the Ukrainians.
And what Mr. Morrison recounted to you was substantially similar to what Mr. Sondland recounted to you, right?
Yes.
And so, regardless of what Ukrainians may say now that everything is out in the public and we're here in this public hearing, that they felt no pressure from President Trump. It was your clear understanding, was it not, that in early September, when the pressure campaign was still secret, that the Ukrainians believed that they needed to announce these public investigations? Is that right?
I know that the Ukrainians were very concerned about the security systems. And I know that they were prepared or preparing to make a public statement, that is, with a CNN interview, that was being planned. Those are the two pieces that I know.
And that CNN interview was to announce these investigations as you understood it, right?
That was the implication. That was certainly the implication.
We've been focused a lot on the September timeframe, but I want to go back 2 months to July, before the July 25th call. And you testified, Ambassador Taylor, in your opening statement that it was in the middle of July when you understood that the White House meeting was first a condition on these investigations. Is that accurate?
Yes, we were preparing, and I agreed that the White House meeting was going to be an important step in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. So in June and in early July, attempts to work out a way to get that meeting included a phone call. And so there were several conversations about how to have this phone call that eventually happened on July 25th.
And you described in your opening statement a July 10th White House meeting with a number of officials where Ambassador Bolton used the term that something was a drug deal. What did you understand him to mean in hearing that he said that used this term drug deal?
I don't know. I don't know what Ambassador Bolton had in mind.
And was that in reference to a discussion in that meeting related to the White House meeting that President Zelensky wanted and in connection to the investigations?
The context of that comment was the discussion that Mr. Daniluk, who was Mr. Bolton's counterpart, Ukrainian counterpart, from the National Security Advisory, had with Mr. Bolton. And that conversation was very substantive up until the point where the White House meeting was raised and Mr. Ambassador Sondland intervened to talk about the investigations. It was at that point that Ambassador Bolton ceased the meeting, closed the meeting, finished the meeting, and told his staff to report this meeting to the lawyers. And he also later then indicated to Fiona Hill, who was also a participant on NSC staff, that he, Ambassador Bolton, didn't want to be associated with this drug deal. So it was, the implication was it was the domestic politics that was being cooked up.
And did Ambassador Sondland say this in front of the Ukrainian officials, to your understanding?
Ambassador Sondland, in the meeting where Ambassador Bolton was having a conversation with his counterpart, raised the issue of investigations being important to come before the White House meeting that had just been raised.
And Ukrainian officials were there?
And Ukrainian officials were in that meeting, yes, sir.
Now, around this same time, in mid-July, did you have any discussions with Ukrainian officials about these investigations?
I don't recall.
Well, let me show you a text message that you wrote on July 21st, where you wrote it again to Ambassadors Sondland and Volker. And if you could just read what you wrote here on July 21st.
Gordon, one thing Kurt and I talked about yesterday was Sasha Daniluk's point that President Zelensky is sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely as an instrument in Washington's domestic re-election politics.
And Sasha Daniluk, I think you just said, is Ambassador Bolton's counterpart, right?
He's the National Security Advisor to the, he was no longer, but he was at the time.
What did you understand it to mean when Zelensky had concerns about being an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics?
Mr. Daniluk understood that these investigations were pursuant to Mr. Giuliani's request to develop information, to find information about Burisma and the Bidens. This was very well known in public. Mr. Giuliani had made this point clear in several instances in the springtime. And Mr. Daniluk was aware that that was a problem.
And would you agree that because President Zelensky is worried about this, they understood at least that there was some pressure for them to pursue these investigations? Is that fair?
Mr. Daniluk indicated that President Zelensky certainly understood it, that he did not want to get involved in these type of activities.
Now, I'm going to move ahead now to July 25th, which was when President Trump and President Zelensky had the phone call. But before we get to the phone call, I want to show both of you a text message, neither of you is on this text message. It is between Ambassador Volker and Andrei Yermak, a top aide to President Zelensky. I will read it because neither of you is on it. Ambassador Volker says, "Good lunch, thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate / get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow. Kurt." And this was less than a half hour before the call actually occurred. Now, Ambassador Taylor, was Ambassador Volker with you in Ukraine at this time?
He was.
Did you know that he was prepping President Zelensky for this phone call with President Trump in this way?
Not in this way, Mr. Goldman, but I knew that Ambassador Volker was prepping Ukrainians for the phone call earlier on. That is, at a meeting in Toronto on July 2nd. Ambassador Volker had a conversation with President Zelensky and had indicated in a phone call that he at that time was going to talk President Zelensky through the steps that need to be taken in order to get to the phone call.
Understood. And you testified earlier that the security assistance had already been frozen, to your knowledge, at least by July 18th. Is that right?
That's correct.
So that was just a week earlier than this.
That's correct.
So just so we're clear, Ambassador Taylor, before this July 25th call, President Trump had frozen the security assistance that Ukraine needed, and that the White House meeting was conditioned on Ukraine initiating this investigation, and that had been relayed to the Ukrainians. Is that an accurate state of play at this time?
That's an accurate state of play. I, at that point, had no indication that any discussion of the security assistance being subject to conditioned on investigations had taken place.
Right, but you understood that the White House meeting.
That's correct.
All right, let's move ahead to this July 25th call and between the presidents. Now, am I correct that neither of you were on this call? Is that right, Mr. Kent?
That's correct.
And you were neither as well? So you both read it after it was released publicly at the end of September?
Yes.
Yes. I want to spend just a little time reading the transcript, as we've been encouraged to do. And I want to particularly note 4 excerpts of the transcript. One that relates to the security assistance we've been talking about. Another that discusses a favor that President Trump asked of President Zelensky. A third where President Trump asks the Ukrainian president to investigate his political opponent, former Vice President Biden. And then a final one where the Ukrainian president directly links the desired White House visit to the political investigations that President Trump wanted. So let's look at the first excerpt which is near the beginning of the call when President Zelensky discusses the military aid that the U.S. provides to Ukraine. He says, "I would also like to thank you for your great support in the area of defense. We are ready to continue to cooperate for the next steps. Specifically, we are almost ready to buy more javelins from the United States for defense purposes." Now, at the time of this phone call, Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent, you both knew that the aid had been frozen. Is that right?
That's correct.
And Ambassador Taylor, you testified that President Trump obviously also knew that the aid had been frozen as well, since he was responsible for doing that. Is that correct?
That's what I had been told. That's what we heard on that conference call. Yes.
But to neither of your knowledge, the Ukrainians were not aware of that at that point.
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
But right after President Zelensky thanks President Trump for his great support in the area of defense, President Trump then says, and we'll go to the next excerpt, "I want you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people. The server, they say Ukraine has it." And then at the end of the paragraph, he says, "Whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible." Now, Mr. Kent, you've testified a little bit about how important this White House meeting was to President Zelensky. How would you expect a new Ukrainian president to interpret a request for a favor from the President of the United States?
I cannot interpret the mind of President Zelensky other than to say that it was very clear that what they were hoping to get out of this meeting was a date and a confirmation that he could come to Washington.
Obviously, you can't put yourself in the mind, but if the Ukrainian president, for a country that's so dependent on the United States for all things, including military assistance, is requested to do a favor, how do you think the Ukrainians would interpret that?
Well, if you go further into the call record as part of this, and we don't have it on screen, but to the best of my recollection, reading it after it was released on September 25th, President Zelensky went into having whatever your problems were, that was the old team, I've got a new team, and we will do whatever is appropriate and be transparent and honest about it. I don't remember the exact words, but he was trying to be, in his own words, be responsive to conduct the business of Ukrainian government in a transparent and honest manner.
Now, when he talks about this CrowdStrike and the server, what do you understand this to be a reference to?
To be honest, I had not heard of CrowdStrike until I read this transcript on September 25th.
Do you now understand what it relates to?
I understand it has to do with the story that there's a server with missing emails. I also understand that one of the owners of CrowdStrike is a Russian American. I'm not aware of any Ukrainian connection to the company.
Now, are you aware that this is all part of a larger allegation that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election?
Yes, that is my understanding.
And to your knowledge, is there any factual basis to support the allegation that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election?
To my knowledge, there's no factual basis, no.
And in fact, who did interfere in the 2016 election?
I think it's amply clear that Russian interference was at the heart of the interference in the 2016 election cycle.
Let's move to the third excerpt that I mentioned related to Vice President Biden. And it says, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son. This is President Trump speaking, that Biden stopped the prosecution and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible. Now, at the time of this call, Vice President Biden was the front runner for the Democratic nomination in the 2020 election. And Mr. Krent, are you familiar, as you indicated in your opening statement, about these allegations related to Vice President Biden?
I am.
And to your knowledge, is there any factual basis to support those allegations?
None whatsoever.
When Vice President Biden acted in Ukraine, did he act in accordance with official U.S. policy?
He did.
Now, let's go to then the last excerpt that I wanted to highlight, which is President Zelensky speaking. And he says, I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also want to assure you that we will be very serious about the case and we will work on the investigation. Now, Ambassador Taylor, right after President Zelensky mentions his much desired Washington visit, he says, on the other hand, and then says that Ukraine will be very serious about the investigation. Is this the same link between the White House Trump for security assistance that President Trump had just frozen? To which President Trump responded that he wanted President Zelensky to do him a favor, though, by investigating the 2016 US election and the Bidens. And President Zelensky says that he will pursue these investigations right after he mentions the White House visit. Is that your understanding, Ambassador Taylor, of what we just read?
Yes.
And Mr. Kent, is that yours?
Yes.
I yield back.
The majority time has expired. Would you gentlemen like a brief recess? Let's take a 5-minute recess and then we'll resume with minority questioning.
Okay, all right. And so in doing that, when they ask the question, every time that it gets close to the President of the United States, it is very clear. There is no conditionality as it relates to what why the aid was held. And so I think that we're consistent with that, and that's what we continue to hear.
He said very clearly also, Gordon Sondland disappeared after he spoke to the president. He wasn't one of these investigations.
All right. So, yeah, sorry to jump on. Well, we also know from Gordon Sondland, who now has sworn testimony that says he has no idea. You covered it. has no idea why the aid was ever held up. And so any knowledge that anybody has of what Ambassador Sondland may or may not have known, he is on the record to say that he does not know why the aid was held up. So if he doesn't know it and he's conveying that to someone else, he's conveying something that he doesn't know. And so when we start to look at this, it all starts to fall apart when you start tracking it back to who actually knew what when. The aid was held up for two reasons. I can tell you. One is the president has a deep-rooted concern about corruption that is shared with the two witnesses in there today. They are concerned about the corruption that Ukraine has not only had, but even continues to struggle with today. The second part about that, and you've heard it a million times from this president, isn't it important? Isn't it critically important that the French, the Germans, the UK, that they pay their fair share? Why is it always the American taxpayer that has to spend millions of dollars? And yet, even under this administration, not only were javelins given for the first time, but also aid was increased to Ukraine in spite of all of that.
But is it believable that Gordon Sondland doesn't recall this conversation with the president?
Well,
two witnesses say that he did relay this information from the president. Is it believable that Gordon Sondland just simply doesn't know?
What two witnesses? Are you saying? Well, Ambassador Taylor is the one who said that. So let's be specific. And Morrison testified the other day, and to my knowledge, they have not released his transcript. I think it would be highly appropriate for Mr. Morrison's transcript to be relayed, because I think when you see that, not only will he convey some of the things that are being talked about today, but he'll also convey the fact that the vice president made it very clear there was no condition whatsoever as it relates to the aid, and that the aid was released shortly after the vice president of the United States made a personal in-person visit with President Zelensky in Warsaw, Poland. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sondland himself does not seem to have testified to that.
Am I concerned?
It seems like Gordon Sondland did not testify behind closed doors about that phone call.
Well, Ambassador Taylor, I said in his entire interview, he didn't testify to it originally. Anyway, it's amazing. Well, but he was prepping to come up here. He prepped for hours to come up here, and then all of a sudden, voila, he gets this miraculous intervention from one of his staffers that reminds him of something. So no, does it concern me? I think what happens is when we start to look at the facts, everybody has their impression of what truth is. Just like all of you as reporters have your impression of what truth is. The ultimate judge will be the American people, and I think most of them will see what I'm seeing in that room. It's reporters and people in the audience who are yawning, because this is all about a policy difference between the President of the United States and a few people at the State Department.
Do you think there's new evidence, this new information?
Well, I think this new information is no. I mean, I'm not here to question anybody's motives. What I'm saying is when it becomes second, third, and fourth hand, and it's relayed about the facts, we know how wrong it can get. You're a journalist. What's the key is you always look for your sources. You look for two people to confirm it. And so at this point, we don't even have that from a journalistic standard, let alone an impeachable standard that should be higher than your journalistic standard.
He backed up what Ambassador Taylor said in his saying right here. So,
what did he back up? I mean, I was in there for 7 hours. You weren't in there. With all due respect, Leanne, you weren't in there. I was in there. So, what part are you talking about that he backed up?
Everything that Ambassador Taylor testified, as far as he knew, he took issue with one small detail,
But he wasn't in there for the testimony. What he's talking about is the opening statement that was leaked by my Democrat colleagues to a few of you so that you could report out that. So he wasn't there. He wasn't privy to it. He hasn't read the deposition. And so as you look at that, you need these broad sweeping statements that are not based on reality or facts of being in the room.
Do you really believe?
Go ahead.
The internship was Drawing out questions that Ukraine lives could have been lost from withholding aid. Your reaction to that?
Well, one, he doesn't properly show the appropriations process. If we know how the appropriation process works for foreign aid, this delay was actually a delay for future assistance that ultimately did not happen. So there's no lives that were at risk. And if we want to look at lives being lost, when Russia invaded, it was under the Obama administration. And there was no defensive weapons. Actually, the aid has increased. So if we want to talk about saving lives, and you want to compare and contrast two different administrations, the Trump administration has done more for Ukraine than the Obama administration has done previously. Do I contest what? Well, I contest that. No, I don't contest that it was held up at the direction of the president. I think other people. What I do contest is the reason why it was held up. The president not only held up aid here, he held up aid to Lebanon that still remains on hold. He held up aid to other places. We have multiple witnesses that say that part of this president's reset with regards to foreign policy is not to just send $4 appropriate. Hold on, let me finish. To not send foreign aid to other countries without there being some condition applied to it. And that condition has nothing to do with investigations. It has to do being a good steward of the American taxpayer dollars.
The underlying question whether or not this was ended up to investigate the Bidens. That's the implication.
Well, that's the implication. That's what the Democrats have been saying for 6 weeks. I can tell you that the closer you get to the president, the vice president, Secretary Pompeo, those are in the know. The condition that was placed on this was placed on two things. One is Europe doing their fair share in terms of Ukraine assistance, and a corruption scheme that has long been a systemic problem in Ukraine had to come to an end before we said.
Then why should Mick Mulvaney come and testify and reveal what he knows exactly about what happened here? If everything is fine, he's a person who's been people been talking to that placed the hold here.
Listen, you're talking about somebody who's been on oversight for a number of years. And you know, as well as anybody, that what I love to do is get from a direct source. At the same time, having the chief of staff of President Obama come and testify on anything never happened, never will happen. Whether it's this president or any future president, you can't go into that inner circle. It puts a chilling effect on the president of the United States' ability to do his job. Yes, I'm sorry.
For the case you're making to be true, every single witness.
Well, the case I'm making is true. Yeah.
For the case you're making to be true, every single witness who has testified, more than a dozen of them, would have to be either lying or mistaken.
That's not correct. Your characterization is so inherently wrong and biased. I can tell you.
No. They believe the Bidens were the focus of the presidency.
So let me ask you this: for the American people, how many hours have you been sitting in these depositions? How many hours? I haven't seen you. No, you have not read all the transcripts. You've read the. I beg to differ because they haven't all been released. So there's no way that you've read them all. But I can tell you, your premise is not right. I've been in those depositions, and I can tell you there's contradictory information. This president had not put any conditions on the aid. And certainly, when we talk about impeachment, why are we doing this? Why are we all here 11 months from an election? Why not let the American people decide? All of a sudden, what happened is the Mueller investigation didn't work. The Russia collusion didn't work. Now they're going to have Ukrainian 2.0. I'm just telling you, I see it for what it is. It is partisan and it is political. It has no basis in the in these
witnesses are a part of Congressman. Just taking away the quid pro quo, is it okay for any future president now to ask a foreign leader an investigation into their political opponent?
Yeah, you got to understand the backdrop of what this is all about. Is it okay if I run for president or vice president that I am somehow immune to any investigation? The answer to that is no. I don't think any of us would say just because you run for president, you should be immune. The second part of that is this. The backdrop of this comes from a 2016 connection to Ukraine. The president was being accused that he coordinated or that the Russians helped him, and yet there was equal evidence that Ukraine took part in some of the disinformation that was applied to the 2016 elections. And I say that, a lot of people say that's a conspiracy theory, that's not accurate. But let me just tell you, this too this fact remains. Either Nellie Orr lied to Congress, where she talked about a Ukrainian connection, or there was one. There's no in between.
Testifying just now, saying that there was no American official that tried to interfere in any sort of investigation into Greece.
Well, that he is unaware of. His testimony is at direct odds with Nellie Orr, who gave testimony. I was in there and you can look at the transcript. Nellie Orr said that indeed it's a person by the name of Sergei Leshchenko, the Ukrainian that actually put forth the information, gave her information to Fusion GPS. But listen, all of this comes down to why would the president actually hold up aid prior to a phone call and never mention it? All of you cover the president more than anybody else. Is he not a direct individual who speaks directly on what's on his mind? He doesn't. Hold on. Does he not speak his mind? In fact, you guys criticize him for speaking his mind. And yet a phone call happens on July 25th. No mention of aid in that phone call at all. It's not the president's style. It's certainly not what's consistent with the way that he's done.
The president have dispatched Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back.
Was it okay for him to do that?
Listen, the president obviously at that particular time was looking at a defense from the 2016 election charges. That's why Rudy Giuliani got involved. Hold on, let me finish, Manu. And so as we start to look at that, the whole context of why Rudy Giuliani was involved was as a defense of this president against false accusation. What came out of that, beyond that, in the whole Biden charisma, I think that is a footnote, a side note that we're all wanting to talk about now. Why don't you talk about the fact that there are some merits to the fact that Hunter Biden was on the board and that Vice President Biden, at worst case scenario, should have recused himself from interfering with some of those decisions in February 2016. Last question.
About this call, the fact that Sondland allegedly said when asked about Ukraine policy, the president cares more about the Bible. What does that tell you about his credibility?
Well, I think that what that says is that Master Sondland has an opinion. You'll get to hear from him in a few days, and you'll find he has lots of opinions. Some of those are based on fact. Some of those are not. And I think at the end of the day, when you look at what's based on fact, you'll see that there's not merits here. Thank you, guys. I got to run. Yeah, I got to run.
Committee will come back to order. The chair now recognizes the ranking member and minority counsel for 45 minutes. Thank you. The call summary for which the Democrats want to impeach President Trump is dramatically different from their nefarious depiction of it. What it actually shows is a pleasant exchange between two leaders who discuss mutual cooperation over a range of issues. The Democrats claim this call demonstrates extortion, bribery, and a host of other monstrous crimes being committed against President Zelensky. Yet President Zelensky himself insists there was nothing improper whatsoever about the conversation. Indeed, the routine nature of the call helps to explain why, in this committee's last public hearing, Democrats recited a fictitious version of the call instead of reading the actual transcript. The Democrats depicted the president saying, quote, "I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, understand? Lots of it, on this and on that," unquote. The transcript did not show President Trump saying anything remotely like that. The president did not ask Ukraine to make up dirt on anyone. The Democrats are not trying to discover facts, they're trying to invent a narrative. And if the facts they need do not exist, then they'll just make it up. Not only does President Zelensky deny the Democrats' characterization of the call, but as Ambassador Taylor testified to this committee, the Ukrainians did not even know at the time of the call that a temporary delay was put on the security assistance for them. Furthermore, as the ambassador testified, these holds occur from time to time. Both he and Ambassador Volker were confident the delay would be lifted. And in fact, military aid to Ukraine has actually
substantially improved since President Trump took office. Ambassador Taylor testified that President Trump was the first president to see that Ukraine was afforded Javelin anti-tank weapons. This was a very strong message that Americans are willing to provide more than blankets. This was the Obama administration's approach. Note this important fact. The security assistance was provided to Ukraine without the Ukrainians having done any of the things they were supposedly being blackmailed to do. So we're supposed to believe that President Trump committed a terrible crime that never actually occurred and which the supposed victim denies ever happened. I'd like to briefly speak about the core mistruth at the heart of the Democrats' impeachment drive. They claim the president tried to get the Ukrainians to, quote, manufacture dirt against his political rivals. This is supported by precisely zero evidence. Once again, the Democrats simply made it up. But let's consider the broader question about why President Trump may have wanted answers to questions about Ukraine meddling in 2016. The Democrats downplay, ignore, or outright deny the many indications that Ukrainians actually did meddle in the election. A shocking about-face for people who for 3 years argued that foreign election meddling was an intolerable crime that threatened the heart of our democracy. While the brazen suddenness of this U-turn is jarring, this denial is a necessary part of their argument. After all, if there actually were indications of Ukraine election meddling, and if foreign election meddling is a dire threat, then President Trump would have a perfectly good reason for wanting to find out what happened. And since the meddling was aimed against his campaign, he'd have good reason for sending his personal attorney to make inquiries about it. What's strange is that some of the witnesses at these hearings and previous depositions who express alarm about these inquiries were remarkably uninformed about these indications of Ukrainian election meddling and why the president may have been concerned by it. For example, I noted previously, Alexander Chalupa, a former staffer for the Democratic National Committee, admitted to